Thank you for joining our fourth webinar, the fourth session of SEO Next Gen. First, maybe technical. Can you just in the chat tell me if you can hear me or not? Then we have an idea about that. I see people they are still joining us, and I see you hear me, so that's fine. So then I would say, okay, we just start. So my name is Bram Pauwels. I'm marketing manager from Universum, and I am very pleased to welcome all of you for the fourth session of our SEO Next Gen sessions, which ended up, of course, to be all online, but we received quite some nice reactions, so that's nice. Thanks for that. Today we have Bastian Grimm from the German agency PCase. He's already there, as you can see now, and he can't wait to start. But first, it's still my turn. So Bastian, he's he's a co-founder and CEO of PCase, and also the director of organic search. And today he's going to talk about e-commerce SEO. I will shortly introduce Universum for those who don't know us. I know most of you followed at least one or more of the previous sessions, so maybe not really necessary, but still for those who didn't know us. So we are a digital marketing agency, and we are specialized in SEO and content marketing, also in online advertising and social media advertising. And besides that, we also help companies in their digital analytics and their dashboarding. We also help companies on national level and international level in their more global marketing strategy. So that's also something, if at one point you need this, you can, of course, come to us. Here you can see a few of our references. We have customers both in B2B and B2C, and as you can see, in many different domains. So we do for e-commerce, of course, lead generation, but also donation generation for NGOs, and also drive-to-store campaigns, for example, for Leonidas, Delvaux, etc. So this is, oh no, I forgot something, which is maybe you don't care at this point now, but we do, because this is our team, and we think the people, our colleagues, they are really important to do in the end what we do every day, but not only our team, but also, of course, you as a customer, or the people we work with and the people we support in their digital strategy. So then I think now I can give the floor to Bastian. Maybe just some more practical issues. So you will get the slides, so you don't have to ask in the chat if you will get the slides. You get them after the webinar. You will also get, like always, the full replay of the webinar. And if you would happen to have a problem with the sound or the video, which can happen, I think right below the slide there is a link which says use another video player. I thought it said. You can click on that one, and then normally it will go better. If you're still facing some problems, don't hesitate to put it in the chat, in the public chat or in the private chat, and then we can take care of that. So I would say, Bastian, thanks for joining us straight from Berlin. I think it is, of course.
Yep, that is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
Well, I give you the floor now. Thanks a lot, Bastian.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good morning to everyone. I suppose for most of you dialed in, it is still morning and early. Anyways, yeah, it's good and sad at the same time, right? I would have rather been over in Belgium, honestly speaking, because I very much enjoy kind of the in-person event atmosphere, but I suppose most of you would agree. So I think we make the best out of it and have some fun, as well as I would say SEO related or SEO centered discussions around one of my favorite topics, or I think one topic hugely important, at least for those that somewhat are dealing with e-commerce, online shops, selling goods online, I guess, in a wider sense. So what I try to do for today is kind of focus and emphasize a bit on some of the most, I would say, common issues that we are seeing as an agency. And as Bram mentioned, we have a bit of a similar setup to Universum. Like PKs is Berlin-based. We're roughly 130. We do organic as well as paid search, and therefore obviously dealing with a whole variety of like e-commerce related clients and setups and situations. So I thought, why not put together what we have seen over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, and try to point out the most common issues and challenges. Because and there's a other reason actually why I think that makes very much sense, and there should be more dedicated sessions to specific verticals. And that is, shops are not really shops, and they're all not really the same, but they have very much, and websites as well in general have very much different challenges, right? So if you are in e-commerce, you probably have to deal with different issues for the most part than a classic kind of publishing company would have to deal with. And even within e-commerce, you would probably have different recommendations from an SEO perspective. For example, depending on let's say the size of the domain, but also the vertical that you are in. So if you're selling, I don't know, 5 to 10 products, a very specific niche, then that might look very much different from like the very large kind of multi-retailer setups, right? So I think one of the issues that we have in SEO is that people tend to generalize, and I think that's oftentimes a mistake, because there's very specific, oftentimes, circumstances around a certain recommendation, and you need to understand the bigger picture. Nevertheless, I try to generalize as much as I can. It will be technical for those of you who have seen me maybe speak somewhere else. I've learned software development a long time ago. I still have a favor for the tech SEO topics. So it just happens to happen that I do very tech-heavy SEO things, which just as a quick housekeeping note, maybe on the site, as Bram mentioned, we have the chat. I try to follow along as much as I can while going through it, and feel free to do questions in between, but also, afterwards is fine. I guess we will have plenty of time for Q&A in the end. But if it fits, feel free to do that, and I try to kind of answer them along the way, right? Okay, so without further ado, I think this is pretty much good for an introduction. I want to start with like 10 tips that are somewhat centered around, some call it category pages, some call it like the hero pages of like more general topics, as well as the product detail pages or article detail pages, either way, because I think those two types of templates or pages probably have the biggest levers when it comes down to anything e-commerce. So the first topic that I want to go into, and again, you get the slides. So there's sometimes those summary slides have too much content, I'm aware, but this is more for you to follow up as a reference afterwards, so that the more visual slides still make sense. I think this is what it really is. So the one topic that I want to start with is indexing strategy in a wider sense. So what is going into the index, and what not, and why is it not a good idea to treat all things equal, right? So I think most sites that we are looking at where they haven't been optimized yet, or there was someone maybe involved that hasn't like a deeper experience, there's a lack, or at least not a thorough crawling and there's a difference there, and or indexing strategy in place, right? There's some very common things that you see over and over and over again when you are dealing with online shops. And this can be anything from, sorting lists or like sorting categories by different types. That can be, generally speaking, filters, can be pagination. You need to probably have a look at what you do when you have product in different variants. We talk about that in a second, but like, let's say, in different colors or different sizes, members areas, wish lists, you name it. So there's a whole bunch of different types of pages there that probably shouldn't be indexed altogether, because that would just load up the index, and then there's no really value, putting in everything, right? So starting at the very beginning, I think one of the issues that we see a lot is that there's a lack of targeting, right? So in this case, this is taken from Walmart. And again, I picked random examples, various shops around Europe and sometimes even the US. But if you have something like this and you're selling, Walmart groceries sells fresh fruits online. But if you have, and there's a bunch more, it's only showing 4 here. If you have, a whole bunch of category pages all being optimized, or in this case, not even being optimized, but targeting the same keyword, which is fresh fruit, you make it very, very hard for Google to dissect and understand, which is the category page that they should actually rank for that specific term, right? So you should pay very, very close attention to like a clear terminology, and even more important, to differentiation, right? Like there's no sense in putting 4 of those, or they have way more than that, pages targeting the same keyword into the index. That just doesn't make any sense. Oftentimes what you come across is tons of unnecessary or I guess unused sorting or filtering, right? So again, what's really weird is if you have lists like this, I mean, this is not really, or options, an amount of options like this. This is not really an SEO issue per se. I mean, yeah, it turns out to be an SEO issue, but first and foremost, this is something that you would need to address and tackle, probably from an analytics perspective in the first place, right? So I would argue that if you look into your analytics and you would kind of segment it by the filter and then try to understand which of those are actually being used, you will probably see that most of them in this case are entirely useless. So I think the reduction is the first thing, and then you can think about what you do from an SEO perspective. So you maybe block them from crawling, because they would all be the same, right? If you sort a list up and down, it's still the same list, right? So you would not need 2 versions of that being indexed in the first place anyways. So filtering and sorting is a big problem for most systems, which you certainly need to be aware of and then tackle respectively, right? This is actually one of my favorites. So the one thing that really drives me insane is that you have, and this is a German screenshot, so apologies, but what it says, it's articles per page, right? So you have a listing page, and then you as the user, or the end user in this case, would be able to say, I want to see 24, 48, or 62 items on that page. Every single scenario that I have had a look in the past X years, and I can't even recall how long that was, literally no one, and I'm talking about less than 1%, is doing that. Like everyone is using the default. So, but if you're not dealing with this from an SEO perspective, this is each URL times 3, right? So crawling waste, potentially conflicts of indexing. Don't do it. Again, analytics first, try to find out if anyone is using that. If not, get rid of it. Pagination is also a big topic. We could probably spend the next hour or 2 talking about that. So there's a link in here that is really cool. It's a study done by a company called Audisto. Coincidentally, they're also Berlin-based, and they basically have a crawling tool. And what they did is they kind of did a whole bunch of tests on types of paginations and the way you can link them, right? So you have like page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or you have like page 1, 2, 3, and then nothing, and you link the next page. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. And the reason why I don't want to spend too much time on it now is it's very specific to the size of your inventory. So again, go back, find out how much categories you have, how much products you have, and how they are linked internally, and then go back and pick the right type of technical implementation for the pagination. So it's really important to understand first and foremost what you do want to achieve with pagination, right? Because maybe if you can link all your products from a list of 100 on the first page, then you don't need a pagination, right? So this is a bit of the challenge here. It's very specific to context in this case. And I know that pagination in general, from a technical perspective, also kind of got quite interesting, specifically because of this. So Google's John Mueller went on record a while ago saying, well, if you go in and you have, pagination in place, like page 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, a lot of people, including myself actually in the past, have recommended to set the paginated pages to no index, right? Because there's often been the case that, all of a sudden the page 2 was ranking instead of page 1, for example, or, something like, well, why would you bloat up the index with paginated pages when you only want to kind of the first page to be found in anyways, because those has your strongest selling products, right? So we went on record, most of the SEOs that I know at least, said, well, no index for page 2 and following. However, then what happened is they went on record saying, well, but a long-term no index, and sadly that hasn't been specified, I would say. What does long-term even mean in the first place? This would then lead or being treated internally as something similar to no follow, which would mean if you would put your page 2 on no index, or the products being linked from page 2, would essentially the links wouldn't really work in quotation marks because they're all internally no followed, right? This is what happened. So again, this then would mean that, well, if you care about your articles and you need them to be linked from page 2 because they're not linked elsewhere, then potentially no index is not the right way for you. However, you could also argue that no index can make sense if you ensure that all your products somehow are linked from the page 1 in a category, right? But think about what you really want to achieve. Don't blindly index or no index. Just ensure that your products are linked properly, and then a no index is still fine, right? Again, it's about context in this place. Another classic on pagination, and then I'm done with that one, this is taken from a German company called Tausendkind, which essentially, and there's a whole bunch of others that do the same mistake. So if you have the pagination, oftentimes page 2 works without a parameter, right? So you only have like page equals 2 or p equals 2 for page 2 and following. What they do is they have also a p equals 1 for the first page. But they also have the first page without the p equals 1. So essentially it's a duplicate. And then they're internally linking to the wrong one with a parameter, which breaks their internal linking. So that's a bit of a shame because the strongest page 1, is somewhat only reachable indirectly, which, well, from an SEO perspective, is not really great. So yeah, understand pagination. I think it's a hugely complex topic. Try to figure out what your shop software currently does and how it's implemented, because there's oftentimes a whole bunch of quick wins that are somewhat there and can be leveraged. So number 2 is content quality. Even though that's not specifically like an e-commerce topic, it's still relevant for e-com as well. Sometimes people argue that this is mainly a publishing topic. I would frankly disagree. Also from a shop perspective, duplication is happening oftentimes. So, some of the common causes of duplicate content, I'm sure you're all aware, just a quick recap, right? So non-dub versus dub is a duplicate, would be a duplicate, HTTP, HTTPS. I mean, everyone should be moved over to HTTPS nowadays anyways, but still, if you haven't put the redirects properly in place, that would be duplicate content. One of the more like nitty-grittier details is the third one here. So the URL parameter order is actually also something that people oftentimes miss. So this page would probably result in the very same content output, right? But the parameters are ordered differently. So color black for the first URL is in the beginning, and for the second URL is in the end. That for Google is basically, or are, 2 different types of URLs. Therefore, if you're not tackling that, either redirecting it or having, canonical text in place or whatever, that would result in 2 different pages being duplicate. So that's something that you need to figure out and fix. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of other ones. Case sensitivity, so uppercase and lowercase should be unified. Without trailing slash is another classic, I would say, not specific to ecom, but generally. So make sure that only one of the versions work, and the other one should properly 301 redirect. On the right-hand side, production servers versus staging and testing servers. Yes, that is still a thing. A lot of people still, don't take care properly. So of course, staging and testing servers should be blocked in the first place, right? And I'm not talking about just robots text, but rather password protection or something else. So make sure, or IP, or either way, but just make sure that it's not being indexed. That would not be a good idea. And From a product perspective, this can also be quite interesting because so this is taken from Otto, which is a large German multi-category retailer. So what they have, there's like this smartphone case, I think it is, and they have 2,400 smartphone cases, and the only difference is that it's a different color or for a different phone model. But I mean, this is essentially the same product, right? So you don't need 2,400 of those product detail pages being indexed. As a matter of fact, this is just diluting crawling and as well as link equity internally. So would be probably better to have like one page and then like an on-site selection that's not being crawled and not being indexed in the first place. And then there's those kind of, well, I would say classics, right? So there's oftentimes those kind of pages or URLs that are generated automatically for different types of pages. So in ecom, for example, if you have ratings and those ratings or reviews are on a separate URL, then of course, not for all products, there are actually reviews or ratings in place. But if you have like an empty page where it says, well, for that product, we do not have, reviews or ratings or anything, then that's of course something that you would not want to put into the index in the first place. So this is a reference you can go after, can go check afterwards and then see if any of that is applicable for you. I mentioned that already earlier. So number 3 on the list is kind of multiple versions of a product. What I mean by that is that, this is taken from ASICS. So this is the exact same shoe, the Gel Nimbus 22, and it's just available in different colors, obviously, and also in different sizes. So what ASICS does is they use individual URLs for each of those available colors and size variations. And you can imagine, so that shoe exists in, you can see it on the top right corner, probably like 10 different colors, and then you have it times the different sizes, and that results in hundreds of URLs for one single product, right? But there is not really a demand for someone searching like the ASICS Gel Nimbus 22 black and then even in a size 40, right? People don't do that. Paid search, I get it. You want like the targeted ads, fair enough. But from an SEO perspective, you probably won't. There's various ways to deal with that. One solution could, of course, be to kind of canonicalize to a root product. So you still have those URLs there, but then you say, well, my strongest selling one is the black one in a 41, for example, and all of the other ones from an SEO perspective would canonicalize over to the root product. That's fine. Again, keep in mind that the canonical tag is only a hint, not necessarily a directive. So Google could choose to, or well, oftentimes they actually do choose to ignore it. So Search Console would tell you that. So go there, try to figure out if your configuration that you have currently set up actually is working. So you can use the inspect URL tool there and then see if the URL is really the canonicalized one. On the left-hand side, a bunch of implementation recommendations. So, only one annotation, no broken, no chaining, consistency, etc., etc. Again, if you're relying on canonical tags, please revisit the list afterwards and see if there's anything in there that might be applicable for you. From architectural perspective, a very nice solution, maybe as an inspiration, is what Salomon does. So they also selling shoes, and what they do is they have one single product URL. So this Supercross shoe is available at supercross.html, and the only thing that they are doing is they're using kind of a client-side front-end solution utilizing like the hash. So you can still link in there for paid search, which is totally fine and also, of course, totally needed. But from an SEO perspective, this significantly improves the crawl budget as well as the link equity, because everything points to this one single HTML document and it's not being distributed between hundreds, which are essentially all the same, except for the size of the color. So yeah, multi-product is something that you need to revisit and deal with. This is somewhat equal, but also slightly different from the architecture perspective. But if you have a product that is available through multiple categories, and I know it's early, but well, gin is always fine, right? So, Gin Kiosk, they are selling one of my favorites, Monkey 47, actually, a great gin if you're a gin fan. And what they have it in most popular and international, so in 2 different categories. But they actually duplicating the product detail page, even though it should be the same, right? It's of course reachable through different categories, but it should not be on 2 different URLs. So again, if that's something that you're doing or that you have a use case for in regards to, well, it's available in multiple categories, please revisit the category structure and make sure that you do like the identification, how someone got into the tree differently, but not based on the URL, because that would just break internal linking unnecessarily. One solution is what Otto does. So what they have a product folder in /p, and then every product resides in there. Of course, you could also always just use canonical tags, or you could index the second variant, but they all have some disadvantages from a crawling or indexing perspective. So I would always, like, in my mind, it's always reduction first. So ideally I have one URL. If I can't do that, then it's potentially a no index. If that doesn't work, then it's a canonical, just because the canonical is such a weak signal these days. So either way works, but make sure that you at least tackle it accordingly. Then another kind of configuration thing I would probably call this is branded categories versus brand filter. So what do I mean by that? So in this case, we have Breitling watches, right? So there is, on the left-hand side, there is the category watches. And then, of course, you can, as in most shops, you can filter by brand, right? So you can just click and you got just the watches from Breitling in the tree. And on the right-hand side, you have what is oftentimes called like a brand page or a brand doorway page, or whatever the name for that is. But essentially, people are building like a specific page just dedicated to a brand that goods they are selling for. And oftentimes it's not one and the same, because technically, well, the one is like a filtered list and the other one is like this huge inventory page. But essentially, they're targeting the same thing. So if that's something that you're doing, then I would strongly recommend to revisit and see that this is either being kind of on the same URL, or, again, canonicalized, no index, because, how should Google know which of those 2 is the right one to be shown for Breitling watches, right? Like you just, again, make it unnecessarily complicated. Of course, you could now argue, well, if I link the one more than the other, and that's true, of course, you give a signal in preference to one or the other, but ideally, you just make it clear in the beginning, and that would mean you only have one, or they're somewhat tied together. All right, expire products, out of stock products is also an interesting topic. Random example here from Marks and Spencer's over in the UK. Marks and Spencer's currently has 230,000 products out of stock, but still in Google Index. I think we all agree that from a UX perspective, at least I'm oftentimes like really annoyed by that. So you search for something, you click, you see it's out of stock, you don't get any options, and what happens? You bounce back, right? Because you just go to the next one, and that's super frustrating from a UX perspective. However, and I think this is also, by the way, maybe a side remark. Of course, for those 233,000, and therefore, like, the behavior data would be very much different, right? Because it has a higher bounce rate, probably a much shorter time on site, right? So I think what you really should do is kind of conceptually thinking about how to deal with out of stock situations. And there's a whole bunch of different ways, of course. And that's oftentimes also depending on, is that product potentially coming back? And if so, when is it coming back? Will it be sold out forever? Is it sold out because there's now, let's say a successor product, or maybe it's just this one color is not available anymore, but the other one is. So like there's a bunch of questions from a logical perspective that you probably need to answer within your software, but then decide on, will I be redirecting to the same product in a different color? Or will I be maybe redirecting to the successor product? Or if I don't have anything like that, maybe I will redirect to the internal site search. Or if it's gone entirely and I don't want it anymore and it's not relevant, I can, of course, also like send a 410 status code. I'm a huge fan of informing users with about these things, because if you do something, then, well, that's something that they not necessarily expect in the first place. So like a layer or like an info box or something oftentimes also helps to actually increase on-site conversion if you need to move them to like a different product for, you know, any of those before mentioned reasons. Or, I mean, you can put it on no index maybe and use it for lead gen if you know that thing comes back. There's a whole bunch of different ways to approach it, but just don't do it as Marks and Spencer's does it. Just keep it in the index. Don't do anything with it. It's not really helpful because, of course, that's just growing. The more your inventory is actually rotating, which is not really cool. Same is true actually for paginated categories. So if you have categories with a high churn, right, where, you know, sometimes there's enough products to fill a page 2 and sometimes that page 2 disappears and there's only page 1 and then it comes back. So what is happening meanwhile, right? In most scenarios, if you're not taking care of that, then the second page is just returning a 404 for a while, which is also not really a great user experience. So, you know, again, come up with a solution for that. That might be temporarily that the page is then redirecting to the first page and then will be respun, or, you know, there's a bunch of ways to do that, but a 404 is rarely the best idea. Faceted navigation is also a hugely complex topic, I think. So like a random example, this is taken from Zalando. So Zalando has, of course, I mean, being not only a fashion retailer anymore, but like I picked the fashion or like fashion shoes example in this case, but like, of course, they have products and categories with a whole bunch of different attributes, right? Sizes, colors, brands, price, availability, you name it, right? So this is what we usually call a faceted search, right? Which is somewhat a restriction of the selection according to different types of properties or, you know, parameters, characteristics, whatever. And from an SEO perspective, if you would put all of those different types of combinations into the index, that would oftentimes, and for Zalando, that's easily millions and millions of URLs. But those would not necessarily provide any value, right? Because, well, they are already available in like the default category tree in the first place, right? So I'm not saying faceted navigation per se should not be indexed, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm saying you need to be very, very careful and very much aware which types of combinations actually have search demand. So I'll give you an example. Like for Otto, I've been involved in building that platform years and years ago. Like we made faceted navigation actually something that you can in the backend kind of configure, and for certain types of facettes, you would be allowed to say, well, those are supposed to go into the index. So dresses is something that you have in different colors: red, blue, purple, I don't know what, right? And then you could say, well, for that, the color, yes, but the price tag, no. So you could configure that. And we went even one step further because we figured out that red dresses, black dresses, they have a high search demand. So that facet makes sense, but purple, no one searched for. So we went even into the facet and made that configurable so that we were very, very careful on how much of the URL inventory you actually want to be crawlable and indexable, because otherwise that can escalate very, very, very quickly. And then you have a huge problem with thin pages or low quality pages. Boots does something which also works really well. So they implemented like a client-side solution, which is essentially utilizing JavaScript. So then they have their faceted tree. When you click on it as a user, it only reloads certain fragments. And the great thing about that is because you're not reloading the entire page, it also very much feels faster, right? So like the perceived speed due to the client-side solution, because you're only loading fragments, is way faster. So this can be like a nice like intermediate solution as well. So number 8, excuse me, is structured data. I mean, again, this is by now at least a hugely, I wouldn't say necessarily complex, but there's a lot of different types of structured data that some are specific to ecom, right? So a couple of examples here. Rich snippets based on structured data. So, of course, ratings, reviews, price, yes, but ratings and reviews is not necessarily specific, right? That can be a rating in the review for something else as well. But what is specific for ecom, of course, availability, so in stock information, price range, etc. So this is taken from schema.org or like structured data in a wider sense, which you should certainly implement, just because, well, the beauty of it is that you can see on the screenshot is it gives you more real estate in the search results. Therefore, the snippet is more prominent, especially with the rating and the availability. If someone has a sense of urgency to buy, and if you can say, well, it's in stock, I think that is certainly something that you should do. You can, there's a tool from Google which you can use, and it gives you like some debug information, if implement, and this is very important, like you should do that certainly before you roll it out, because broken schema, if you roll it out, it sometimes takes forever to recrawl. Search Console will be flooded with error messages and whatnot. So make sure you test before you actually roll it out. I think this is very important. Sadly, they will discontinue the structured data testing tool, which is a bit of a shame. So there's a bunch of alternatives in the slides here. There's a great tool from Bing. There's one from Yandex. So if you work internationally, those two you should certainly be familiar with. And then there's a whole bunch of others that are listed below, depending on the objects that you're using and the type of schema that you're implementing. Or if you name of the Google tool, it's the old one is Quentin. The old one is the structured data testing tool, which is the one that I had on the slide. Let me quickly go back here. And now they have, so kind of Google's new one. I mean, it was there for the same amount of time, more or less, but like the one that they're recommending to use is the rich results testing tool. So kind of, I don't know why actually, but sadly, bit different type of functionality. So this is why I thought I put in a couple of alternatives. They are all free, and if you want it even easier, there's a free one from Write, which nicely integrates into Chrome. So you can, like, for any given page, you have like this the label on top in the browser, and then you get the objects and like the nested info, and you can drill down and see if implementation is done, and it validates against the schema document type definition, which kind of already tells you if your implementation is right or wrong, right? I mean, of course, you can also use any type of crawler, right? Screaming Frog now allows you to kind of do structured data validation, sitemap, deep crawl, whatever you like. But certainly make sure that when you implement schema or structured data, that you ensure it will be tested or is being tested properly before you roll it out. Just as a quick closing note on this one, because there's oftentimes confusion, there is a bunch of SERP features, I would probably call them, or things that Google displays in search results that in the first place look like, well, they are schema powered, but they are not necessarily. So some examples here, the lower one is from Autoscout, which is like a car marketplace. It says like the monthly leasing rate. It looks like it's structured data, but it's not. So sometimes Google just extracts things and displays that a bit differently from like the regular snippet. So this is just taken from the HTML without any structured data, or like the featured snippets on top with like the bullets and whatnot. This is not structured data. This is essentially Google just taking, especially for like informational queries, Google just extracting content from a destination page and then showing that somewhat differently. There's if you go to my SlideShare account, then there's a whole bunch of presentations around like featured snippets and structured data and whatnot. But Gabriel is saying Screaming Frog is efficient and cheap. I totally agree. Probably one of the Swiss Army knife tools. However, I must say I'm also quite impressed by what Sitebulb has done in the last 12 months. I think they also launched a fantastic product at a very, very like low cost price tag, I think. However, though, and I think you could now argue, and I would say it's probably true, it's not only about the price tag, because if you're dealing with larger sites, desktop-based tools can only do so much. I mean, of course, at PKs at least, we use like all of them somehow, but if you want like to do full site crawls with millions and millions of URLs, Screaming Frog is not my weapon of choice. But I guess everyone has their preferences, right? So this is what I'm saying. Most of the tools nowadays have some kind of schema validation or schema extraction features in place that do the job, right? Yeah. So the next topic, XML sitemaps, is something that again is not necessarily ecom specific, but what I see often is that people make fundamental mistakes in the way that they actually building or adding URLs or URL inventory to sitemaps. So what I mean with that is essentially with sitemaps, the only URLs that should be present are actually the ones that result in an HTTP 200 response, right? So don't put no index URLs, don't put URLs that are blocked in robots text, but also don't put URLs that point with a canonical tag elsewhere, right? They can't rank anyways, or they're not supposed to rank. So only the ones that result HTTP 200 and are self-canonicalized should go in an XML sitemap or XML sitemaps, depending on your inventory. Quick test again here is an example from Screaming Frog. You go into the list crawl, you can download the sitemap or sitemap index, it pulls it down, you get on the right-hand side, you get the drill down based on status code. Either way works. What I also like to do with sitemaps is to do like a gap analysis. So this is taken from Deep Crawl. And what it does is basically Deep Crawl, similar to other crawling tools, they of course crawl the site or through the site either way. And then if you specify or if they find or both a sitemap, then you can do a comparison that gives you like an info what is missing in your sitemap, which probably should be in there, or the other way around. So what's only in sitemaps, but not linked internally. So this kind of comparing and overlaying the various crawl sources, I think oftentimes is a great way to identify like hidden issues as well as potential. And then the last of the 10 is around web performance, because, well, I mean, obviously, my take on this entire situation is that of course there is, there's SEO advantages for having fast loading websites, but first and foremost for me, performance is actually user experience, and fast loading time is absolutely essential for a good UX. And I guess, this slide I've been using probably for the last 3 years at minimum. And I think now we somewhat have this official confirmation, if you so will, where Google says, well, UX is kind of to become a ranking factor, right? We all don't know what that means in detail. We all don't know how big or not big the impact will be. But what we do know is that they started pushing and continuously talking about what's called the core web vitals. And the idea is to kind of establish 3 different types of metrics that are somewhat there to evaluate like the perceived page experience from a performance, but also from a UX perspective, I think you could probably say. And again, this is a hugely complex topic where we could spend a while on, but just to be, just be aware that this is coming next year. Again, there's and I think I have it linked later as well, but just saying it now, like there's a deck on my SlideShare account if you care about web performance, if you want a guide through the most common issues and how to fix and solve them, it's there for free. What's also new and quite interesting, I'm not sure if you've seen that, it was introduced in Chrome 85, only in Android for now, is something called fast page labeling. So if you tap on a URL but you not release it straight away, it gives you like this info layer, and Google is telling you already, based on the historical data, if that result is actually going to load fast or slow. I guess that's just the intermediate step in between them maybe also introducing something into the search results, right? We have seen for AMP, if you recall, we have seen this icon of something that says or suggests that the AMP page is loading fast. Well, I guess we shall see what's going to happen there, but certainly a lot of movement on that front. And yeah, this is the checklist I mentioned, so I can flip through that. The other thing, which is interesting, however, I'm not the biggest fan, I have to say, but just for the sake of completeness, there's also AMP, right? So Google's old kind of push into performance, accelerated mobile pages, which now is kind of a full framework where you can even go and build, full e-com experiences, I would probably call them, based on their framework. So that looks like this, right? So on the left-hand side, you can see the regular search result. There's also the icon that I mentioned. Then you have a native AMP landing page, which completely is cached and preloaded, therefore ridiculously fast. Same for the product detail page. And then you can even combine it with non-AMP. So what they did here is that the checkout is still like a regular mobile web page, if you so will. So both works, but of course, like especially the listing page and the product detail pages are, due to this kind of unfair advantage that Google is actually pre-caching them, very, very fast. However, I would always say, well, make sure that your site is fast first and foremost. And if you then feel the necessity to play with AMP, that's fine, but that should not be an excuse to have a slow loading site, right? So I think those are the 10 kind of areas or topics I wanted to kind of touch on. However, I have some brief questions, I would probably call them, and then of course also open it up to you guys if there are any other questions. But I try to answer some of the common what if scenarios that we get frequently asked by our clients, right? So the one thing that often happens is, so what if I need to delete or rename categories, right? I think that happens literally every day. And I think one thing that I just want to point out here is quickly, don't forget to 301. So if your category names are somewhat bound to the URL naming, then of course, make sure that those are redirected, right? Especially if an old URL was somewhat linked externally or has traffic or something like that, make sure to redirect and just don't simply deactivate or delete because you will lose that traffic. And also make sure that you don't do it like this. So no chaining. You need like a routine in place that somewhat also recrawls and rechecks, because, if you have living structures, so to say, then sometimes when you redirect to something and that something changes at some point, then it might be a 404 at a later stage. HTTP status IO is a cool and free tool to do also bulk checks and whatnot. I really like it. You can mass import, upload, download, cost you nothing. So if you have testing to do and you don't want to waste money on the next tool, then that might be an alternative. Again, redirect chains, this is taken from Deep Crawl, but chain reports, they all do somehow. Just make sure that you have a consistent solution in place that's continuously running, right? And also make sure that you kind of have a word with your developers, because of course, implementing the redirect is one thing, but you want those to be linked directly and not through a redirect. So code hygiene and cleaning it up, internally linked redirects from templates, they should go at some point. And then also fix those internally linked 404s. I mean, that's obvious. This is taken from Search Console, but I would argue that 1.47 million 404s is certainly not a great quality signal. And even if it's not being treated as one, it's certainly a waste of crawl capacity. So what if I have no time to write my own titles or descriptions? I would argue at least try to use simple templates. So this is not great, taken from Taco, like a fashion site. What Google generates for you is often, at least in our experience, kind of the worst. Those snippets are not really good in terms of readability. They oftentimes cut off. They're weak in terms of CTA or something. So make sure you have at least a basic fallback logic in place that does generate unique titles and unique descriptions. If they're not unique, then it's very, very highly likely that they will be used or classified as duplicate content. So that's also not great. Another question that we see frequently is, what if I need to use URL parameters for tracking? Well, tracking first and foremost should be not done by using regular parameters. So if you can use the shebang or the hash in this case. Also make sure that you not use parameterized tracking URLs for internal linking, right? So this is taken from Zoo Plus, like a food shop for dogs and cats and whatnot. They implemented tracking, but what they do is they don't do it with a GTM or any other way. What they do is they hard link the tracking parameters, which is, of course, from an internal linking perspective, a total disaster. So if you doing that, I would recommend to change it over. And it's not only UTM parameters, of course, it can be all types of internal link parameters. It oftentimes is a massive problem in terms of duplication. There is URL parameter settings in Search Console, right? I mean, this is probably also worth mentioning. That works. The issue is, in my mind, you're only doing it for Google. You're not really fixing the root cause. I would very much rather prefer to do it on an application layer or server-side level. So whenever I have the chance, I would go and recommend 301s. However, if you, especially from an agent perspective, if you're not familiar with the domain, this is oftentimes a great source to see URL parameters that you might not be aware of. What if I don't or can't or whatever, for whatever reason, show all my content? Like, can I use this text expand feature? So there's a quick test that we did. I just repeated that. So content visibility changes, you can do that in various ways, right? So this is done with CSS annotations. That works quite well. So basically, this is opacity. There's a bunch of different ways to do it, of course. But so the way the test works is basically shown here on the left-hand side. There's 2 test phrases taken, right? And on the left, you can see this is taken from the visible part of the test page. It's being found. The second, bit is taken from a piece from a content that was not visible straight away. Same result. It is being found, but it's not being highlighted, right? So that's the difference. And again, of course, the content was available in the markup, right? It was nothing that has been loaded after, just on a side note. And so that means essentially that we tested a whole bunch of things: opacity, display none, position, overflow, you name it. The results are all the same. The only way where you can preserve the highlighting, which is what you want because you don't want to use that competitive advantage with the bolding or the highlighting in the search results, is the overflow hidden. So if you're using that and if you have implemented that, make sure that the developers did that based on that. There's also a bunch of JavaScript ways to do that, jQuery, plain vanilla JS and whatnot. Funny enough, most of the JavaScript solutions are also using overflow internally. So it works the same way. But yeah, so if you have an issue with that and it's not being highlighted, it might be the implementation that the developers have chosen. Again, coming back to speed, because that's the default question, I like to have a default answer if someone asks me. So this is relatively quick. But what can I do? I mean, one of the quick fixes that should be in place for everyone is, not getting rid of images, but offloading images, make them lazy load. There's lazy sizes, which is a JavaScript library that allows you to lazy load product images. This now, which is great, is becoming much more easy. There's native lazy loading now available in all the new kind of common browsers. So essentially, just on the IMG, you add something like loading equals lazy. There's various plugins on WordPress and other systems that allow you to do that, even without touching the code. And that works really, really well and makes a significant difference. Internal site search is also a quick one. So make sure that you do not by default just index your internal site search results because, well, they are usually thin. And if not taken care of, then that's something that at some point might really get you in trouble in terms of the content's quality. So internal site search by default should not be indexed because that's just SERP in SERP, which Google doesn't like very much. And then the second last, how do I deal with personalization? Because that's also something that oftentimes happens, of course, due to testing and tracking and whatnot. I think generally from an SEO perspective, it's totally fine. Just use the non-personalized standard view that you would give anyone whom you don't know, right? So if I come to your website in the first time, you do not have any information about me. This is the view that I get. This is the one that you should use for Googlebot as well. As long as that's the case, and you add the personalization level or layer on top, it's totally fine. And then the I think last thing that we have is boilerplates, or oftentimes you have shipping information or repetitive content pieces, bits and pieces or paragraphs that you don't want to be indexed or appear. Oftentimes in the past, that would have happened by using, for example, an image, right? Because they're not, adding that image to the content. There's something, a concept or technical thing called CSS selectors that you might want to look at. So CSS selectors work in a way, and I think probably easier shown here. There is some content that can live in CSS, and there's some content that will live in the HTML, right? And that said, or from a user perspective, this looks all the same. So on the right-hand side, you can see it from Search Console, right? So CSS, HTML, for someone visiting the site, you don't spot a difference. But for Google or for Googlebot, it's quite interesting because it's a significant difference. So if you see, again, like the test left and right, for the content that lives only in the CSS selector, that won't be indexed. So you could put something like shipping info that you don't want to be indexed, or a legal text or anything in the CSS selector, doesn't, dilute your page quality, and the rest, of course, in the regular HTML will be indexed as always. So I think this is also a nice way to kind of deal with that. Yeah, so I think this is pretty much it from either way for today from me. We, I think, do have a bit of time for questions if there are any. So probably open the floor. I think we answered some of them already on the go, but yeah, I guess now would be your turn if there are any. Or was that all information overflow and you're all now like, oh, geez, that was 1 hour and now I need to go to lunch probably?
Probably, maybe I already have a question for you, Bastian, and
yeah,
maybe some others can still follow afterwards. I was just thinking, because we're talking about lockdown in Belgium, and I know in Germany as well.
Yep.
And of course, we all know it has a huge impact on e-commerce. But what would be your best advice to cope with this impact and to really benefit as much as possible from it?
I think one of the big things that we have seen, and that was at least the case in the, let's say early days and in March and April this year, is that a lot of the e-com sites actually were struggling at the point where they where they didn't have had enough inventory, right? So I think, that is already the biggest challenge, right? If you have inventory, I guess that already is almost kind of like winning the game, because there was so much stuff sold out. Like if I recall webcams and whatnot, right? We were trying to still, we were all already kind of in home office and we had those like mobile setups, but like we were still trying to get some of the stuff and it was just impossible. So I think, given that you have inventory, I think now is really the time and I think Google just recently released also like a quick advice or blog post around that, to prepare for like those seasonal things that are coming, right? We had there was Amazon Prime Week, we have Black Friday coming. So I think those topics are hugely seasonal, on top of the potentially higher demand from what is going to be like a lockdown situation again. So I think for me, that would be just making sure that not only from an SEO perspective, but rather from like a logistics and operational perspective, I have strong foundation, right? That could be call center, that could be support, that could be like my let's say like the season pages for Black Friday, or dedicated landing pages with special offers. Maybe have a separate hosting for them on an AWS cloud if that's something that has huge demand, etc. So like bringing really, or making sure that the core actually works, because that's oftentimes where it already kind of fails. And then no matter what kind of marketing or nice things you do on that, that's all great and nice. But if the page is just not loading anymore, then you're already lost in the first place, right?
Okay, thanks.
And I guess also on top of that, maybe just a follow-up comment, like what we've seen like internally with the teams, especially with Dominique's team who runs our content, is that there's often also the necessity now for like just different type of communication. So we've been seeing a lot that we would probably not execute a regular kind of content campaign, but maybe just help our clients with, let's say, the change of the scenery, if you so will. So like all of a sudden they need to run webinars, so we probably would need to help them doing that. So that is a very different type of content marketing at that point to what they would have done before, right? So I think it just really comes down to how and where are you affected as a business, and then trying to see what you can leverage out of this. I don't like to call it new reality, but like the new circumstances probably.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. I don't see any more questions popping in. So maybe I think it's 12 o'clock now. Exactly. I can hear the church.
Yeah, on the dot. Yep.
Yeah, that's it. So I would say, Bastian, thank you very much for this interesting webinar. Indeed, it's a little bit more technical than what we saw in the other ones, but still, I think quite interesting for me and also for the audience. So thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for joining us also today and also in the previous ones. Of course, as I said, you will get the replay and the slides of this webinar as well. And then if you still have any other questions or whatever information you need, of course, don't hesitate to get back to us. So I would say thank you very much and see you soon, let's hope. And Bastian, thanks to you too.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.